Africa has played an important role in China's global strategy for the past 2 decades. Africa's bilateral trade with China surged to a record high last year, that is 2022, highlighting how Beijing's commercial influence over the continent continues to rise. China's exports to Africa were $164.49 billion, according to China's custom authorities, while imports alone reached $117.51 billion. Nigeria is Africa's largest importer from China, while South Africa is the biggest exporter, followed by Angola and Democratic Republic of Congo. We are joined in studio by the Executive Director of the Africa-China Center for Policy and Advisory, Paul Frimpong, to go depth into why China is the leading investor in the African continent so far. So we are here in studio. Good afternoon, Paul. It's good to see you.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
Great. Help us understand. For the past decade, it appears there's been this increasing drive for African resources. But how would you describe China's role and interest on the continent?
Yeah, rightly so. I think there's been a growing momentum when it comes to Africa-China relations. And this, whichever angle that you're looking at, of course, there are narratives, right? So if you are on the side of China, you know that you can see some positive conversation happening there. If you're on the side of the West, of course, on the US side, you can see another narrative which also counters what China's narrative is. But in all, I think it boils down to what I term the suitability of the Africa-China relations, right? So this scenario that we've seen that has generated a lot of conversation, I said earlier, from different quarters, what is making the relationship tick? Why is Africa doing more with China and has been doing more with China over the last decades, and even anticipate that it's going to do more with China? Of course, China doing the same with Africa. Now, the suitability conversation, I can take you back to a certain scenario, which I call a friend in need is a friend indeed scenario, right? So in the 1990s, if you ask anyone around the world, except on the continent, about their perception about Africa, right, there are certain things that comes in mind when they talk about Africa in the 1990s, right? So first, they're going to talk about the disease burden. So at the time, a lot of countries across the continent were in a bit of disease, mess. HIV was a prevalent, issue on the continent. Even in Ghana, we have what we call the 6 killer diseases. We helped kick polio out. Remember, we ran a campaign in Ghana in those early 2000s, right?
Yes. So
those were prevailing conditions on the continent. Secondly, you talk about some of the civil wars that were also experienced on the continent. So we had not just country civil war, but we also had intra-country civil war. We talk about the Rwanda genocide of '94, the Sudan, and all of that. We had Kenya, Tanzania war, which is the intrastate civil war. So that was also a precondition on the continent of Africa. The third aspect that they can also mention about the debt crisis. So in the 1970s, a lot of countries have taken a lot of debt, and getting to the early 2000s, this debt had matured. At a point, some countries were even using 70% of their GDP in the year to service the debt, not even pay the main debt, right? So that gives you the kind of perception in terms of risk on the African continent in the early 1990s, getting 2000. So at this point, when we talk about investing in the African continent, the risks were high to some quarters, especially in the Western capital, right? Of course, they are driven by profit. And we know the Western model of investment when it comes to the private capital, right? So they look at all analysis. Okay, is it too much risk for me to take on investing in Africa? And of course, the answer was obvious, yes. So we didn't see that. Now, guess what? In early 2000. There was a whole game changer when it comes to the Africa-China relation. That was when, really, China started real investment in the African continent in 2000. In May 2000, the economists branded the African continent, based on all these risk factors, as a hopeless continent. I mean, you can't blame them, because, as I said, diseases, civil wars, and, of course, debt crisis. So we were branded as a hopeless continent. In October 2000, the same year, China hosted what we call the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, where about 40 African leaders met in Beijing to start a process. And Winston, the FOCAC and everything that we've seen happening between Africa and China within the last 2 decades has been the pivot around which all these investment numbers that we, of course, will go deeper has happened, right? So perception is one of the reasons why this scenario of increasing, engagement between Africa and China has become real. Because at the point, to the Western and our traditional partners, the continent was not an investment, worthy. Was too much risk. That was when China actually started.
So you read a very interesting phrase, a friend indeed is a friend indeed. At that time when Africa were going through those trying moments, and China came through. What was happening to the prospect of this narrative that indeed China wasn't just there for the continent's welfare, but rather for the resource excavation?
I think that's a very key point that you've made, right? So at the point that you mentioned, that's what I gave the analysis of a friend indeed is a friend indeed. When China came at that point, when a lot of, we talk about refugees, millions displaced people, infrastructure dilapidated, we talk about, unrest and all of that. At that point, the narrative that now is being attributed to China for their investment, of course, Africa dealing with China, was not the case, right? So they were here. Nobody was talking about the amount of risk that they are taking to come and invest. But now, it's not the case anymore. Now we talk about China, being a new neo-colonialist, talk about this new scramble for Africa, talk about the debt trap, of course, but I'm sure we'll go deeper. So that was not the scenario, but that was a key point for Africans, right on engagement with China. And the focus has been a very game changer for the Africa-China relation.
All right.
The second point that I would like to make is about the development model of China. I'm still giving the suitability of Africa-China relations, the model of development for China. Now, Winston, in the last 40 years, the growth rate, the rate at which China has developed and transformed, lifting over 800 million people out of poverty. That is the kind of story that Africa can relate to, because that's what we've been trying to deal with all these decades. We're trying to lift millions out of poverty. Now, China's development model is also unique in such a way that it is the first, and so far the only developing country, to be the second largest economy in the world. All the economies that have dominated the world are mostly from developed, advanced Western countries. China is the first. And again, when we look at the current situation, the developed world that we can learn from, they have received their development journey centuries ago. The one that is more current, that we can actually have a feel of it, is the Chinese development model. And that also makes it very attractive to African countries.
In as much as this development model is attractive, you and I understand the leadership structure in both economies are quite different. Africans, like you made mention, civil unrest and that, and this leadership crisis in most parts of the continent. Would you say, irrespective of where we found ourselves, the prospect of we get into a season where our development was sustainable was far too achievable?
Definitely achievable. And of course, one key element that we are trying to look at is to actually invest in infrastructure to unlock the transformation. And that has been the success story of most of these advanced economies, right? Even Japan, as far back in the early 1970s, 80s, when Japan was a transformed economy, it was because of the infrastructure development. And that has been one of the key tenets of engagement between Africa and China. So you can look across the continent of Africa. In the last 40 years, most of the major infrastructure investment that you've seen on the continent are actually as a result of our engagement with China, right? So we all understand, and this infrastructure investment, we know that the economic, the social implication of it, it's been spoken about, but there wasn't real investment in that until when really China started engaging, or Africa started engaging more with China. So with that understanding, when we keep on this momentum of trying to invest in real infrastructure, tangible infrastructure that can unlock the potential of our economies, obviously, I think we can catch up. We can be the next frontier of economic development in the world.
Ghana, for some time now, have been struggling to maintain its debt structure. The debt increased from 62.6% over the last 3 years to possibly 93.5%, offering around 253 billion Ghana cedis in terms of how much we owe most countries. Bilaterally, China's engagement came to play, where there was this narrative that there was a conditionalities that we may not fulfill, and thereby we may have to forfeit certain infrastructures of our economy to China. What do you make of that? So
2 points, right? So in that scenario, I call it the scare tactics, right? So what the scare tactics means is that you're trying to use the strength in our engagement with China as our weakness, right? So they bring about the debt, trap. And when somebody says it's a trap, right? So it means that you are not aware that you're going to fall into something bad, all right? So somebody is trying to play you along just to capture you. And guess what? Second, there's no evidence of China ever seizing any country's asset. There's no evidence, no matter how it's been spent. Let's not forget the fact that we appreciate the fact that...
So are you saying it's a false narrative?
It's a false narrative. That's what I call it.
No African country can narrate with it?
No, there's none.
So every reportage is false?
It's false. It's a scare narrative, right?
Right.
So, and you can see where this narrative is coming from, basically. So we will not be surprised. There's a great power competition going on respect to the US and, of course, China. So obviously, anyone in between, we are not even regarded. So in this debt conversation, it's being portrayed as if we, as Africans, we as Ghanaians, we do not even understand the kind of engagement that we have with China, our partners. So does it go to say that we've not had any sort of sense of responsibility in all the engagement we had with our Western partners? That's the kind of narrative that is being pushed around, that we do not really understand even our kind of engagement with China. Guess what? When you even look at the debt component, external debt, Ghana's external debt, component, China's debt, our debt to China is about 3% of it. Okay, just 3% of our debt, external debt, is owed to China. Of course, they are the single largest bilateral lender. Why not? Because they are the one investing in infrastructure. You know how much it costs to invest in railways? It's going to be billions of dollars. So obviously, it's going to be more of China's bilateral relation. China is the largest bilateral. But when you compare that to the size of external debt, it's just around 3%. All right? So the remaining is owed to our Euro bonds.
3% is how much of the sum total?
I cannot give the exact figure.
But possibly, roughly.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's around $5.something billion or so, right? So we owe about just 3% of our external debt owed to China, right? And like I said, again, bilaterally, they are the largest lender to us. And of course, they are investing in infrastructure. And infrastructure investment is huge, right? So there's no evidence that China is going to confiscate anybody's. And guess what? Even earlier this year, China forgave 23 interest-free loans to 17 African countries for free. Right? And guess what the narrative came? They are doing that because we are saying that they are trapping this country. So first of all, when you are saying that they are not reasonable, China is going to take over people's assets, they are not going to forgive. They forgive these loans, and then you turn around to say, because you said they're going to take over somebody's asset, that's why they are giving free. So where does it fit? We have to decide for ourselves the kind of engagement we have. And nobody can downplay the role that other developing countries, other developed countries are doing or investing in Africa.
There is another narrative which I would like to get your thought on, that in terms of socio-cultural dimension, there are conditionalities that most countries will have to push certain kind of culture that does not sit well with the domestic, or let's say the receiving country's narrative. What do you make of that?
Well, I think, and we've been...
And has China, in a way, been that influential in that aspect?
I think it's happening. It's an ongoing engagement, right? Because, it's about, cultural exchange, people-to-people exchange. And, of course, the investment, all these conversations we're having is happening at the top level, right? So when it comes to people-to-people exchange, or the cultural exchange is very important, right? And we can see the vast difference in terms of cultural difference between most countries in Africa and China. I mean, we are here, we are speaking English, right? Because of our background, look at the way we dress, right? We are by default westernized because of our history with West, right? So there's a gap, we all appreciate there's a gap, but as the development engagement keeps on rising, I'm sure there will be more opportunities for cultural dialogue and exchanges, between countries in Africa like Ghana and China. That can help us better understand ourselves.
So finally, before we go, but not the least though, but how can we foster this relationship and ensure that this trade relation between China and Africa can be well cemented to ensure the prospect of both parties being beneficial?
Look, let's make this point this clear, that every country is in for their own interests, right? Turkey is here investing in Africa, investing in Ghana for the interest of Turkish, economy. China is doing the same. US, UK, they've all been doing the same. So it's about our interests. Now, when we talk about Africa-China relations, if you look at Africa and our position, right, politically, geopolitically, we are a very instrumental bloc that can go a long way to help China's, global influence in terms of some of the international and multilateral systems and the kind of voting that goes on, right? So it's very important, and this we can leverage. We can use and leverage on it to benefit the kind of development that we want. Of course, natural resources, we all know, right? So for China, for example, they are more interested in investing their resources than going on the international market to go and purchase, because that one, you lose a bit of control, right? So that's the approach that they want to invest in countries. Of course, in exchange, they get access to resources that everybody needs. Everybody is here for natural resources. So we can also leverage on that kind of position that we have, that we endow these resources. And of course, we've had conversation about how we can leverage on our resources to transform. Again, we must have our own development path. How do we want to ensure that we can leverage on agriculture transformation agenda to move to the next level of our development? I think that will help. I'm
sure time may not allow us to get deeper into more conversations, but I'm sure certainly we'll set another platform or another time for us to get more extensive and elaborative discussion on here. I'm sure viewers, wherever you are, you're watching